We are, again, in this book of James. We're talking about steadfast and what it looks like to be people who are steady people. And I'm just curious, how many people, or where are my people in the room, who you are the people that love change? You like things to be different. You like things to just be, there's some of you out there, right? You drive home from work a different route every day just to see what's out there, right? And then where are those of you who are like, I don't want anything to change ever. I just like my world to be static and stable and secure, all right? There's a few of you that are somewhere in between, but statistically, most people are I don't like my world to get disrupted. I don't like change. I would like to avoid change if at all possible. In fact, there are some of you that when I walked out for communion, you were already like, where is Pastor Mike again, all right? Sick last week, gone today, like who's this guy, right? And I'm okay with that, all right? I don't have to be everybody's favorite, that's fine, all right? But I want you to think and realize that we are people who primarily do not enjoy change or do not welcome change. Maybe if you enjoy it, you don't anticipate or look forward to it. But we do live in a world that is ever changing and always in flux. It's always something new, something different happening in our world. And so, how many of you watched the show Downton Abbey? All right, it's this, if you've not seen it, it's a series about this British family, kind of aristocratic family. I like it because it's just calm and peaceful and, great musical score, and I kind of just unplug and pretend that I'm Lord Grantham and have a, house full of staff taking care of my every need. But I realized in the show at one point, I'm like, this guy has never fried an egg or packed a suitcase or done anything ever. What a wonderful, easy life. But what I love about the show is from the start to the finish, it's 6 seasons, you kind of see the evolution of time and the evolution of family, and you see all of the changes that take place. And there's economic change, and there's business change, and there's family change, and there's technological change, there's societal change. And you see the way that everyone is forced to encounter and engage with this change. And I think for us, we are in facing those changes, but you don't get the perspective sometimes of pulling back and seeing how you're adapting to them. This month we are 5 years post-COVID starting, right? Which is kind of crazy to me. But this month we are 5 years post-COVID, all right? And so there's been a lot of changes. I love in Downton Abbey, there's a moment where they add electricity to the mansion, and the grandmother walks into the room and they flip the chandelier on and she holds her fan up and she's like, am I on stage? What in the world? This is the glare, right? But then at the same time, later, society is moving on, there's some changes, and her granddaughter walks in and asks if something is okay because it was not what they thought it should be. And the grandmother said, you're spending so much time in London, honey, stop being so provincial. Accept the modern times and move on. And so there's this reality that life is moving on and we are going to have to be people that adapt and change over the course of time. But we need to adapt and change in the right ways, and we need to have our hearts anchored in truth so that we can be secure as the things around us are unsecure. And so we do live in a time when there's lots of change happening, even now. And there's times where I talk to people and they are very disrupted. And they're like, man, I don't like this and I don't like that. And this is causing me frustration. And I think when the world externally feels chaotic, it's very important that we become attuned to what's going on internally. Because I think what happens is sometimes the external world, we see things we don't like, we see things that frustrate us, we see things that anger us, that bother us. And what's really bothering us is that those things are outside of our control. And so they create frustration, they create angst, they create tension for us. And if we're not careful, we will take all of that chaos that we're feeling out there and we will bring it into our internal world and we'll become very dysregulated people. And so then we will just jump into the chaos. And so instead of becoming people who bring a sense of calm and a sense of peace and a sense of assurance and a sense of steadfastness, we just become part of the chaos of the world. And so James is going to give us some practical ways that we can not just be part of what's going on externally, but we can focus on our internal selves and we can grow internally to be something that creates peace and space for other people. And so I want to think through this text from a big idea today, that what you do determines who you become, right? What you do determines who you become. Pastor Mike has just finished this sermon series, Becoming, which is our annual theme, based on the sense that you are not who you are who you are becoming. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to preach, and during that, I talked through the difference between this version of me and a previous version of me or a future version of me is truly comprised of the places I go, the things I consume, and the energy that I'm willing to expend. And so the things that you do today will determine who you become tomorrow. In the Becoming series, we talk through 7 priorities for the church and really 7 priorities for each individual's life, from spiritual life, financial life, relational life, family life. There's several different areas there. And the things that you do in each of those areas will determine who you become in those areas of your life. And so I want you to think about that as we are reading through and thinking through this text today. And so we're going to be in James chapter 1, looking at verses 19 through 27. And so James starts the text with these words. He says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this." So I love this because he's saying, hey, pay attention to what I'm about to say. Like, this is something to write on a sticky note, stick on the mirror. Take note of this, pay attention to this, underline this. "Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Now, I'm sure I just described everyone in the room today, right? People that are slow to speak and slow to become angry and so quick to listen, right? I have 3 kids, 17, 14, and soon to be 9, so I get to practice this a lot, right? And sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I don't get it right. In fact, I was talking to my counselor a couple weeks ago, and I'm like, hey, I sometimes probably overreact to things because, somebody will lob a bomb into the room, this statement that I just totally disagree with or think is crazy, and I'm like, what do I do? And he's like, Rick, I want you to practice asking 4 questions before you make a statement. And I was like, what? I just want to tell him he's dumb and move on, or tell him that that's ridiculous, right? That's not going to work. And so, we have, as parents, if you have kids, right, you have people you're responsible for and you really have no control over. They are their own moral agents, and you can say, well, no, I have control over them. You do, to a degree, but they can do whatever they want, all right? Now, not without consequence, not without, all of the shaping, but ultimately you're raising people who you don't have control over. You are married to someone that you have no control over. You have a boss you have no control over. And so you live in this world where you don't have control over other people, you only have control of yourself, right? And so James says, hey, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And what I found is as I engage and I ask questions, sometimes the thing that I think they're saying is not really what they're saying. The thing that I'm really frustrated about is just they don't really understand the world yet. And if I can help them better understand the world, I won't have to be frustrated and they can grow and we can grow together. And so there's moments where we need to be slow to become angry, slow to speak, and quick to listen, quick to ask questions. Why? Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires, right? Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Now, is it ever appropriate to become angry? Absolutely, all right? Sometimes Christians are like, no, we just need to be nice all the time. Now, sometimes there are things that should make you angry. Jesus became angry. Ephesians 4 says, be angry and sin not. And so I want you to see this truth. Anger may be an appropriate response, but it is rarely an effective change agent, right? So there are things that are going to make you angry, but your anger is not going to be the thing that changes people's hearts, all right? It can change behavior, but it rarely moves the heart. I can be angry dad and keep everybody in the house on edge and change their behavior. They do what I want. Why? Because they are afraid of me, not because they love me, all right? Honestly, when you love people and you give them love and grace, sometimes their behavior is the things that you don't like and it doesn't stop. And it'll be quicker to stop it immediately if I just were like, oh, I'm gonna crush that. But that doesn't change their heart. And so what you have to do is create this space where we are offering grace to people, we are asking questions about people, we are extending kindness to people, and we are helping to move their hearts. This is what God does with us, right? God's kindness is intended to lead us to repentance. That's what Romans chapter 2 says. God's kindness is intended to lead us to repentance. And so if in the moment of confession, every week we come to God and we were to confess our sin and confess our weakness and confess our struggles and confess our brokenness, we were met with God's anger. We were met with God's wrath. We were met with God's judgment. It would not take long before we stopped coming to the confession table. Right? If you are met with someone's anger, what happens? When you respond in anger, do people move towards you or away from you? Away from you. There's a few who are like, no, that's my guy. I want to move right towards him, right? But there's few of us that really move towards people in anger. When we are coming at people with anger, people are moving away from us. And so God says, no, we meet people with kindness so we can invite people in. I was having dinner with Christy on Friday night, and we ended up at Publix because all good date nights end at Publix or Target, right? And so we went to eat, and then we went to Publix, and then we were driving home, and there was this person in front of me going like 10 miles under the speed limit. And normally that would drive me insane, but we were talking and I really didn't even notice. Like this person, I could tell they weren't sure where they were going. Do they want to turn left? Do they want to turn right? So they were kind of slow, back and forth. But it really didn't bother me. Unusually, it didn't bother me. But the guy behind me, it really bothered. And so I'm kind of talking to Christy and all of a sudden I hear, me, and I'm like, whoa, what's going on, right? And I'm like, so I'm looking thinking like, what's happening? Well, he was just mad that we were going 10 miles an hour under the speed limit. So suddenly he like whips into the other lane and tries to like, clip the back end of my car, but gets stuck behind this other car. So I sped up just enough, to be the rolling roadblock, right? So if you were driving up 1792 on Friday night, I'm sorry. But really, all right? And so, so he, just keeps laying on the horn. The other person finally turned left. And so we just rode. We got to the stoplight. He was 3 cars behind me, and Christy's like, you're enjoying this, aren't you? And I'm like, nah, maybe, because there's a broken part of me that's like, meet me with anger, you're not getting what you want, right? Why? Because anger does not produce the righteousness God desires, right? Honestly, if the guy had just like relaxed for 10 seconds, I would have been going 10 miles an hour over the speed limit like I always am. We'd all been on our way, right? But I have a problem, all right? You do too, okay? We have this reality that we think if I can power up on people, if I can take control of things, I can get everybody under my control. And we can't, right? God has all power and all control. And he doesn't keep us always doing the things we want to do, always the things he would want for us to do. And so God invites us into this relationship, and he gives margin and space for us to make mistakes. He gives margin and space for us to get it wrong. He gives margin and space for us to not always get it right. Why? So that we can grow and that we can transform and that we can become better people. And so God, even in his infinite power, is sometimes slow to speak and slow to anger and quick to listen. So we show up and we say to God, and he's like, again? Yep, again, all right? He meets us with that. In fact, when God tells Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go, and Moses says, God, who should I say sent me? He gives him this name. He says, tell him Yahweh sent you. And it's the most intimate and personal name for God. And what the word Yahweh means is, I always will be what I always have been. I always will be what I always have been. And so this is a promise that though everything else in our life is changing, we have a God who always will be what he always has been. So when we go to God in confession, there is no wondering, like, how is he gonna meet me? What's the surprise gonna be today? What's waiting behind door 3? Like, no, there are no surprises with God. He always will be what he always has been. And so that gives us security and that gives us comfort, right? That gives us margin and space. And so I know you interact with a lot of dumb people on a regular basis, right? You do, right? They're the source of your frustration. They're the reason that you are not slow to speak and slow to anger. But God says, hey, there's margin and space for dumb people. Why? Because he has margin and space for us. And we can anchor our hearts on his unchanging nature, and that gives us margin and space to make mistakes, and that gives us grace for other people. And so God calls us to be people to focus on this internal regulation in a world that is externally dysregulated. When I was in college and I was studying, I took a class called Change Creation and Change Management, right? And in that, a professor said there's one constant in life, and that is change, right? The only thing you can be certain of is that things will change. And so as you face reality, everything around you is changing. God is the one thing outside of that constant. God is the only thing that is not changing. And so we anchor ourselves in that truth so that we can be people who are steady and stable. And so James says, and the next verse here, therefore, what? Since the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God, therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, right? And so you're like, that's exactly what I'm talking about, Rick. The world is evil, the world is vile. Man, it's not like it used to be. If we could just go back to the good old days, right? I read biographies of dead people to remember there were no good old days, all right? Like people have been doing bad stuff since the beginning, okay? And so we tend to think, like if I get rid of all of that out here, but what he's saying is get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, not in the world. He's talking about the moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent in your own heart. The moral filth and the evil that is prevalent inside of you, that the brokenness that is still there, the things that come out of you when you you do that, you say something to someone like, oh, that wasn't really me, right? No, that's exactly you, right? It was just an unfiltered moment where what came out was exactly what came. So he says, well, you work on getting rid of the things inside of you that don't yet look like Christ and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can, the NIV says save you, but another way that could be translated is that can heal you. Accept the word that can heal the brokenness inside of you. Accept the word that can help you to become more like Christ. Accept the word that can heal those parts of you, man, that get so triggered and so angry or so frustrated or so whatever they are. Accept the word of Christ, which can heal you and therefore bring order to your internal self. Right? Verse 22, he then says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Right? Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. Now, I won't say everyone in the room, but I imagine the majority of people in the room looked at a mirror at some point this morning. Like you got out of bed and you looked in a mirror and then you changed something about your appearance as a result of looking in the mirror, right? You plucked a hair, you brushed something, you combed something, you put on some makeup, you did something because you got out of bed and you thought, I'm not gonna go to church looking like that, right? How many of you ever been out in public and you've wondered to yourself, I wonder if they have a mirror, right? And so James says we are to be people that look into the word, that we don't just listen, but we do. Why? Because if we don't do the things the word says, it doesn't bring any transformation to us. And so I want you to see two principles here. The first is this: what we know is greater than what we do. All right, you need to get okay with this because this is true for you for always and forever. Your knowledge is greater than your practice. How many of you right now know there are things that I should not do and yet you did them all week long? Right? How many of you know there's things I shouldn't do or I should do and I didn't do them all week long, right? Like you know donuts taste good and are not great for you. And we go through dozens of them, hundreds of them every week. No judgment, I love donuts, all right? You know there's exercise that you should do maybe, or there's things that you should do, right? You know that thing that you say that your spouse is like, would you please stop saying that? And you just keep saying it. Right? We all know there are things that we should or should not do that we are or are not doing, right? The other thing I want you to see is that listening does not equal doing. All right, sometimes we make ourselves feel good by listening to all the things that we should be doing, but we don't ever actually put them in practice, all right? Like watching Food Network does not make you a chef, all right? Yelling at college football players does not make you a football player. Like listening, watching, absorbing does not equal doing. And so we have to be people who both listen and grow in our knowledge and then also grow in our doing. And so we are called to be people. Look at verse 25 here. He says, whoever looks intently, and I love this, who looks intently. Now this doesn't just mean like stare at it. Like this means to look with intention. Whoever looks with intention into the perfect law, that's the scriptures, that gives freedom. And so James says, just like the person looks in the mirror, why do you look in the mirror? You look in the mirror to see what's out of place, to see what's not right, to see what you are going to change about yourself, or just to admire everything that is right, you know? If that's you, great, all right? But you look in the mirror to understand, where am I? Like, what's the starting point? And then what would I change as a result of seeing that? He says we should go to the scriptures with the same intention. We should look in the scriptures to say, where am I not yet like Christ? How do I need to grow? What is my next step? What am I going to do differently as a result with encountering God in this way? To look with intention. And so if we look with intention and continue in it, all right? Have you start a habit and then it's gone, right? We are now in March, which means most New Year's resolutions are no longer resolutions, right? They're New Year's memories, right? Things that we thought we might want to change this year. Still considering it, all right? But you start it and then you continue it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it. They'll be blessed in what they do. Right? I think as we think about knowledge and doing, right, and the breadth of our knowledge, the breadth of what we do, there's something for us to learn, all right? And so I want you to look, the things that you know, right? So all of the things that you have learned over time create for you a base of knowledge that you currently have. Now, underneath that are the things that you do, the things that you know you should do. There's also things that you should do that maybe you don't even know about yet, right? So you need to expand your knowledge so you can expand your doing. But kind of the overlap of those two things create for us a comfort zone, right? And we live on a regular basis inside a comfort zone where there is an overlap. I know that I should do this and I do it. And I continue in that path unless I purposefully take a step outside of it. Sometimes you get thrown outside your comfort zone, not on purpose. But if you want to grow intentionally, you have to be stepping outside of your comfort zone, or when you get knocked outside your comfort zone, you're able to sit with that and begin to grow. Because what we tend to do is we like to stay inside our comfort zone, right? Why? It's safe, right? Your brain is inherently lazy. Your brain says, how can I expend the least amount of energy? Learning something new requires more effort than doing something you already know. Doing something new requires more effort than doing something you already know. And so the brain's like, no, we already know how to do this, let's just keep doing that. And so we like to live in this space of this comfort zone. But I think if we're going to become what God wants us to be, we have to get called outside of the comfort zone. Or when your kid walks in the room and says some outlandish thing, or your spouse says something, your boss says something, and you find yourself outside your comfort zone, you ask, well, what do I do in that situation? And I think there are 3 zones we can move through outside of our comfort zone. Right? But the first I would just say is, what happens to you when you get knocked out of your comfort zone? Either you decide, I'm going to take a step. I don't know if you were here when we started the Good Initiative a couple of years ago. We talked through this whole thing. We were running through a generosity initiative, and Pastor Mike said, here's what you do. I want you to go right up to the line of what makes sense for you and then take one more baby step. And then the gap of that baby step, that's where faith shows up, all right? What he was really saying is, I want you to take one step outside of what feels comfortable, outside of your comfort zone. This is how growth occurs, all right? And again, there's times you intentionally step outside your comfort zone. There's times you just find yourself outside your comfort zone. What happens in those moments? Anytime you get outside of your comfort zone, your body has an emotional response. Right? Your body has an emotional response to being outside of what feels like safety, security, and comfort. And so your body immediately clicks in and creates for you an emotional response. Now, is an emotional response bad? No. All right. We got one person in the room who's like, no. All right? I think emotions get bad press. All right? How many of you have ever been told, stop being so emotional? Someone's told you that. Like, stop being so emotional. Right? How many of you remember as a kid when your parents were like, just quit crying, I'm gonna give you something to cry about? I'm like, you just did. You know? Like, come on. Maybe you're a parent, hopefully you've never said that. I have said to my kids, stop crying. I have one of my children like, I can cry if I want. I'm like, well, you can, that is correct. That's correct. I can't really stop that, can I, all right? You know, scientists say that on any given day, in any given period of time, we make more emotional decisions than we make rational decisions. Right? We make more emotional decisions than we do rational decisions. Now, there's somebody in the room who's got their arms like, not me, buddy, you don't know me, I am totally rational, right? Sounds pretty emotional if you ask me, all right? You just got triggered, all right? Anger is an emotion, all right? Right? We make more emotional responses than we do rational responses. Why? Why do we make more emotional decisions than we do rational decisions? We do that because of the way God's wired our brains. Right? God has wired our brains to receive emotions. What are emotions? Emotions are feelings that your body is perceiving about your environment based on past experience. So that is what emotions are. Like, you are perceiving things based on the current and present situation, based on all of the previous experience and knowledge that you have, and it's bringing that to this moment, right? So why do you get a little nervous when you step into a dark alley? Because you don't know what's in the dark alley, right? And your body's like, hey, there's something, you need to be careful here. Is it rational? No, it's not rational. It's an emotional feeling, right? It might protect you though. Might not need to protect you, but it's not, you're not rationally thinking that. You're just stepping in like, oh, that feels weird, right? That feels whatever it feels. So you have these emotional responses, all right? I'm gonna just give you a little illustration of the brain here. Pretend my hand is a brain. There's a man named Dan Siegel. He is a neurobiologist. He's a professor at UCLA. He's a psychiatrist, Harvard grad. And he uses this illustration to help you understand the brain. But he says, if this is your brain, at the base is your brainstem, right? The brainstem is your survival brain. Your brainstem is breathing, heart beating, regulating all of the systems of your body to keep you alive, right? If you peek inside the brain then, the next thing up is your limbic brain, right? And this is the emotional brain. This is where our feelings are. This is where our memories are. And all of this is doing the emotional thinking for you. And then at the top of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the thinking brain. This is our higher level thinking. Algebra happens here, rational thought, perceiving and evaluating different things. Strategic planning happens in the prefrontal cortex. And so the brain works from bottom to top. And so if the brainstem can handle it, it doesn't pass it up. The heart just beats and it doesn't have to think about it. Imagine if you had to think heartbeat, 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 like we'd go crazy, right? So your brain does that. Then if it hits the emotions next, and then hopefully what happens is your emotion is perceiving, again, all the things happening around you, all of the previous experience, your memory is resting there as well, and it's taking this information and it's feeding that information off in places that it needs to, but it feeds it to the prefrontal cortex, which can then make rational decisions, right? And so you have these emotional responses, and if your emotions can just solve the problem, it will. But then that prefrontal cortex kind of acts like the last filter before it comes out. The fact that we don't have to make rational decisions all the time is how you can drive on I-4 and not die, right? It's just true, right? You're driving down I-4, it's a peaceful day, 95 miles an hour, right? Just keeping up with traffic, and the guy in front of you, his tire blows, right? And suddenly what do? You slam on the brakes, you swerve, you change lanes, you say some words, whatever, right? Like you have all of this response, right? All of that was an emotional response. None of that was a rational thought. You didn't rationally perceive, what should I do? Let's build a spreadsheet. Let's think about what's the ROI here? Like, no, you just go into survival mode, and your emotional brain takes all of your past experience and all of your current situation, and it creates an immediate response for you. Then what happens? You get through the danger, you slow down to 70, and you kind of have that wash, like the adrenaline that flows through your body. And that is your prefrontal cortex actually catching up to what just happened, where you're like, oh my gosh, we almost just died. Can you believe? And then you start thinking about all of the what ifs and what if this, and how did we get through that? And you don't even know, like you just responded in emotion, right? And so there are times in life-threatening situations where that prefrontal cortex goes offline. Why? So that we can survive. Now, what Dan Siegel says is that sometimes we flip our lids. In conversation, we flip our lids in non-threatening situations, and that prefrontal cortex goes offline, and then all that flows out is this emotional. And sometimes it's rational, and sometimes it's not. It's just missing that final filter, right? I call it you log into Facebook, and then it's like you're just offline, right? You have flipped your lid, right? They're all idiots. And James says, no, be slow to speak, slow to become angry, quick to listen, right? He calls us to be people who, when we get knocked out of our comfort zone and we land in zone 2, which is a fear zone or an emotional zone, to be people that, what do you want to do in this moment? You usually want to retreat back to comfort. And James says, no, step out into that moment and sit with the discomfort. But learn to invite Christ into that moment, learn to invite the Holy Spirit into that moment and say, what do I need to learn about myself? What do I need to learn about who I am? Why am I afraid of this? A lot of times your fears maybe are rational, maybe they're not rational, but there's a reason why you're feeling that. And so you have to sit with the discomfort so you can explore the discomfort and find out, why do I get so triggered when my kid says something dumb? It has nothing to do with them and everything to do with you. And your capacity to sit with things that make you uncomfortable, your capacity to sit with things outside of your control. And so he says, hey, no, be people who are slow to speak, slow to become angry, quick to listen. Why? So that in this moment, you can move into the next zone, which is a learning zone. And I begin to explore, what do these emotions tell me? Why are they there? What's going on? What is about my past that's brought me to this moment? What is about my future that I'm afraid of? And then how do I begin to now take that information and learn and grow and begin to process through that? And so he says it this way. He says, don't just read the word, do it, and then continue in it. Keep doing it. Do it again and do it again. And do it again, and do it again, and do it again. And as you sit with uncomfortable situations and uncomfortable feelings and whatever it is, like your body begins to adjust to that. Your brain begins to adapt. And so now you can walk into a situation and somebody says something dumb, and you don't have to be like, you're dumb. There's a trend on TikTok right now that says we listen and we don't judge. I like to say we listen and we judge silently. You're judging, right? But you don't need to correct everything. Like, why? Because you have this increased capacity. And he says the next phase then, if you move through the learning zone, is the blessed zone, right? The growth zone. You will be blessed in this last thing. So what happens is we tend to think we need to keep inside our comfort zone, but if you can move out of your comfort zone, you can move through the fear zone, you can take a step into the learning zone, you can learn about yourself and you can learn about your capacity. Then you step into this growth zone. What happens is your comfort zone expands, right? The things that you're able to manage, the things that you're able to handle expand. And that's where James says you're blessed. And I would say, as your capacity expands, you're not just blessed, you're also able to be a blessing, right? You are blessed, and then you're able to be a blessing, right? If I can learn to sit with discomfort and not, respond to everything that happens, it's a blessing to my kids because I can be a safe place for them to land, and they can figure things out and say outlandish things, and dad's not gonna react and go crazy on me. He's just gonna let me talk it through. And so we want to be people that we move through this. And guys, this is how growth occurs in every area of your life, right? The first thing that you do is you feel uncomfortable doing it. I remember when I was a kid, I still don't like to be bad at anything. Like I like to be good at everything. But there's a reality, like you have to be bad at something before you can be good at something. Like you have to do it the first time and it's terrible. And then over the course of time, you get better at it, all right? But we have to first be bad at something, learn it, do it, right? If you go to the gym and you can't lift 10 pounds, but you can lift 5 pounds, and you lift 5 pounds 10 times, and you do it enough times, eventually you can lift 50 pounds, right? The same is true spiritually, the same is true of your financial life. As you put these disciplines into practice and as you do them over and over and over and over again and continue in them, the weight doesn't change, the hardship doesn't change, you change. Your perception of it changes. Your capacity changes. And now I can absorb more, I can handle more, and I can be blessed and also be a blessing. And so James ends with verses 26 and 27, and I love here, he just gives us some practical things. Like, so you work through this so that you can be blessed. Then he says this, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves. Right, man, he just like put all of us to the wall, right? You consider yourself religious, but you don't keep a tight rein on your tongue. They deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless, right? There's a second time now that he said you deceived. He says, if you listen and you don't do, you deceive yourselves. If you say you're religious, but it's not changing anything, you deceive yourselves, right? Their religion is worthless. I want you to see this. A faith that does not change us is pointless. Right? A faith that does not change us is pointless. You might go to Bible study after Bible study after Bible study. You might be able to quote the scriptures and know all of these things about God. If your life is not demonstrating that and you are not living that out, no one cares how much you know. God says your faith is pointless. Your religion is worthless. In fact, I would say you're worse than the person who doesn't know the scriptures because you just walk around telling everybody else what's wrong with them. And they're like, hey, look in the mirror, buddy, right? And so we have to be people who are transformed. And verse 27 says this about our faith. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to know a bunch of knowledge and yell at a bunch of people. No. To look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Look after orphans and widows. Who are orphans and widows? In the first century, they're the most vulnerable people in society. There were people that had no one to care for them and no one to provide for them. There was no safety net. And so the church became the people who would look after those who no one else could look after, no one else would look after. And so the church became a refuge for people who found themselves in distress. Pastor Mike says it this way: the strong protect the weak. And I think when we hear that, so often we like to think of ourselves as the strong. Yes, I'll get strong and I'll protect everyone. And that should be our goal. But in a changing, ever-altering world, there are times that you will be in distress. Financially, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, whatever. And so what you need to understand is that we want to be a community of people who look after those in distress. And when we're able, we care for them. And when we're in distress, we have people that care for us. And to keep oneself. Who? Oneself. To keep oneself from being polluted by the world, right? You don't have to keep the whole world from being polluted. That's God's job. He says, look after the vulnerable, look after people in distress, and mind your own business and take care of yourself. Work on what's going on in your internal world. Why? So that your capacity can expand, that you will be transformed, that people will notice the transformation in you. They'll say, man, the whole world is in chaos. You're at peace. What's going on? And you're able to be a person who is then has capacity, margin, and space to be a blessing for other people. If you want to change the world, you don't scream at them. You transform yourself. You offer kindness and grace and space, and you call people to better things. This is what God does for us, and it's what he calls us to be for other people as well. And so I want to encourage you guys. Why does all of this matter? Why does all of this matter? It matters because what you do determines who you become. The things you are doing today are determining who you are becoming tomorrow. And so if you want to change your life, change something that you're doing every day, look intently into God's word, not to gain more knowledge. Look intently and say, God, what about this tells me I need to change about myself? How can I grow? How can I take my next step? I'll close with this. Your next step is undoubtedly moving you outside of your comfort zone. Moving you to a place where you're gonna feel afraid, you're gonna feel uncertain, whatever. But that is how you grow. You move into that place and then you invite the Holy Spirit to sit with you in that. Trust that he will move you forward and he will help you to become all that he knows you can be.